Welcome to this week's episode of Everyday Thin Places. I'm Rachel Gallagher, and I'm an interfaith hospice chaplain.
And I'm Elizabeth Ferrasso, and I'm a birth doula.
And in each episode of Everyday Thin Places, we draw from our experiences supporting birthing people and dying people to explore with honesty, authenticity, and humor how we can all become more truly living people.
So on today's episode, Rachel, we're going to hear from someone who I know a little bit, but you know really well. So tell us about your friend Melody and just a little who she is and what we're going to hear about from her today.
Well, first of all, I wish that this was not just a podcast, but that we had video of this because I am smiling so big right now.
Yeah.
And I smiled throughout recording with Melody because she is just one of my favorite people on the face of the planet. So we got the chance to interview my friend Melody Boyd, and she is an amazing friend. She is a type 2 on the Enneagram personality type indicator. If anybody knows anything about that, that speaks volumes. I always refer to her as the 2iest 2 I know. She is passionate about providing supportive guidance for college students in her role as a professor at the State University of New York. She teaches sociology, and last year she got to take a sabbatical. And the thing that she decided to do on her sabbatical is like a dream come true for someone like me and for someone like you, I know too, Elizabeth. She got to travel the world for 5 months. And you'll hear her talk about traveling to 4 different continents during that time, visiting old friends and new friends, and exploring big cities and small towns. And I'm just really excited to share Melody Boyd with the world.
Yeah. So this is an interview about travel, but we're always going a little bit deeper. So you think there's a topic, and then we have these guests that have so much depth to them that they take us to these new places. And so I love how the direction that this interview took, that we're all sort of grounded right now. We recorded this interview a long time ago when we didn't know how long we'd be grounded. And here we are months later, still grounded. But for all of us that are grounded and can't jump on an airplane and go really anywhere right now, this interview with Melody has so much to offer, just to think about reflecting back on travel and to think about, why should I try to describe it? Let's just let everybody listen for themselves to this amazing interview we had with Melody Boyd about travel as a thin place. Oh, one disclaimer that we meant to make. So we did record this back in our earliest days. This was one of our first couple of interviews. We were still fumbling a lot with technology. We're still fumbling with technology, but not as much as we did at this point. And so I have to apologize that Rachel is going to sound amazing, come through clear as a bell. Melody, even though she was logging on from Rochester, New York, is going to sound totally clear. I was recording with location and equipment that were not very kind. And so my audio sounds awful, but the quality and the content of the conversation were so good. We decided that it was worth it to put this out and to not try to alter it in any way to take away from the authentic conversation as it happened. So excuse the poor audio and enjoy this conversation that we had about travel as a thin place with Melody Boyd.
So Melody, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We're really excited to dig into some conversation about travel as a thin place. And I would love for you to just share with our listeners a little bit about your relationship with travel, and especially some info about your most recent travel adventure.
Yeah, I love this question. And I also really love the framing of a relationship with travel. That's going to be my new relationship status, in a relationship with travel. So I think for me, travel has always been a way to like be curious about the world, to kind of learn and be open to changing and exploring. And I kind of think of travel as a way to kind of crack open my heart. And I think of that as like being like soft and tender to the world and to people. So for me, travel is a way that I try to like change and be soft and learn. Secondly, I think for me, travel is a lot about food. So I love food and I love eating food and I love learning about different types of cuisines. So I love travel for that reason. And then third, for me, travel is a way to connect with people who I love. I live in a city that is different than the cities in which lots of my friends and family and loved ones lived in. So travel has always been a way to be in the same place at the same time with people who I love. So for me, those are kind of three elements of travel that are most important to me. My most recent adventure is I took a sabbatical in summer and fall of 2019, and I did an around the world trip. So I traveled for 5 months and I visited 14 countries and 4 continents. And it was a grand adventure and definitely a life highlight.
So it sounds like some of these adventures are with other people, but I bet there's not anybody you know who could give up 5 months to go to 14 countries on 4 continents with you. So I'm guessing maybe there was some overlap with some friends, also some times where you were traveling by yourself. So I'm really interested in, I guess I just feel intimidated when I think about the idea of traveling by myself. Maybe you don't. And especially within the context of thin places and places where we just become sort of hyper aware of a bigger picture. I wonder if that, I guess, novelty of being in a place and all the familiar things being sort of taken away, maybe you have experienced something in your solitary travel time that is even more powerful than some of us who've only ever traveled with other people. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the solitude during travel is one of the main ways that I experience thin places and traveling. I would say that traveling solo is something that you kind of want to work up to. So I did about half of my trip alone and half of my trip with other people. So for about 2.5 months, which was a little bit broken up between visits with other people, I was doing the trip alone. But that wasn't my first time traveling alone. So I think part of it is like kind of working up to it because it is intimidating and it can be a bit of an overwhelming prospect. But that's actually one of the reasons that I wanted to do this trip because I really value solitude, even though it's also really difficult for me. And so I think for me, that's one thing that makes travel a thin place is that it's both difficult and challenging, but also like really meaningful and a time to connect with yourself. So in thinking about travel as a thin place, I reflected on the pieces about being alone while traveling. I think it requires knowing that things aren't always going to go how you want them to. So there were days when like I felt sad and lonely and it wasn't all like Instagrammable fun adventure. But honestly, those were some of the most powerful days for me where I'm like in a country where I don't speak the language and I have to figure out how to feed myself when I don't understand the way that the market works and that kind of thing. And it can be really lonely, but it can also be really invitational to like being present with yourself. So I think thin places for me mean being really present to whatever is happening. And that can be the joy and bliss of travel. It can also be the like sadness of like, I wish someone else was watching this sunset with me, and like being present to that is really powerful for me. I actually had a moment when I was in Italy this summer that I went to this restaurant that I'd been to previously on a different trip, and I was so excited. I had such good memories of this restaurant. And I'd been like savoring it. I didn't want to go to it right away because I was just like, I'm so excited for this meal. And I went, and they had these gorgeous outdoor seating area. And I asked if I could sit at this table. And the server said, oh, this is all in Italian. So I think I understood what they were saying. Basically said, oh, it's just for one person. And I said, yes. And then they brought me inside to like a table in the corner. And I was so upset. And I had this moment of feeling like I'm getting like sidelined because I'm here by myself. And I could feel my temptation to either like get really angry and check out, or to like pretend it wasn't a big deal and check out. And so what happened though is I ended up getting seated next to this family, and there was this little boy who was probably like 2, maybe 3. And he and I just like made eye contact, and through the whole meal we were playing peekaboo, and he was smiling at me and I was like waving, and we had this sort of conversation, just this kind of verbal conversation, a nonverbal conversation, I guess, across the restaurant. And it was just a powerful moment for me to realize like I could have felt that moment as like an indictment of my status in the world as a single person, as a person who's traveling alone. And I felt a bit of that, but I let myself feel it, and I let myself feel sad about it, but I didn't let it like numb me out or let it make me so angry that I couldn't be present to the situation. So I had lots of moments like that where traveling alone was challenging, but also really powerful, and a way to like be present with myself, both in like the delight of travel and in the challenge of navigating the world alone.
I love hearing from you about the ways that it was hard, and that not all the moments were Instagrammable, and in a way that made it even more meaningful. Because I think a lot of people don't view life that way. And that's one of the things that I really love about you. For our listeners who don't know, Melody is one of my best friends, and we have traveled together. And I just love that outlook. It's so refreshing and realistic and honest.
Well, now I'm going to cry. Happy tears. Yeah, that's really meaningful for me to hear you say that. And I really do think, especially with travel, we can like see the pretty pictures and imagine that it's all like bliss. But I think it's not just about travel. It's about like people's lives, right? So we get these snapshots of people's lives through social media or through other forms of engagement. And we can feel like, oh, this person has it all. They, you know, whatever, they have the perfect looking family, they have the perfect looking meal, they have the perfect looking trip. But of course, our lives are so much messier and so much more complicated. And I think that that's actually where a lot of the richness of life is, in the mess. And so for me, the experience of traveling, like it was glorious and blissful. And it was also challenging, and I cried a lot and I felt sad, and all of those things made it what it was. So I think the beauty really is in the mess. And if we shy away from that, we miss out.
Can I make us rewind a little bit? Because Rachel knows about exactly where you went. But I'm like one of the listeners who hears 4 continents and 14 countries. And I actually, other than knowing Italy at this point, I don't know anything about where you went. So if you, you know, I'm sure you had plenty of people that said, tell me about your trip, and you had to give them the nutshell version. I don't know, give us like a nutshell and a half at least. I want to hear some more about it, but tell us, you know, about this trip.
Yeah. So I would love to actually connect with what you mentioned before about friends. And so part of why I planned the trip the way that I did is that I have friends who live in several different countries. So I kind of planned my trip around places where I knew people, and then kind of filled in along the way. And so I'll briefly say the countries I went to, just in case people are interested in that. And then as I was reflecting on the idea of thin places, there were a couple like actual physical geographic places that felt like thin places to me. In addition to, of course, these other aspects of thin places, like the kind of emotional connection. So I went to Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Egypt, Turkey, Hungary, Austria, Czech Republic, Italy, Switzerland, Spain, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand. And there are so many amazing places in those. But there were, I think, 3 places where I really felt like this physical place is a thin place. And one of them was Saqqara, which is just outside of Cairo, Egypt. And I had spent the day at the Great Pyramids in Giza, which are, classic ones that you've seen pictures of in your history books, and they were beautiful and amazing. But about an hour outside of that is Saqqara, which is where the original versions of the pyramids were built. So it's basically like the prototypes. So it's the oldest human built complex known in history. And it's in rubbles and it's in shambles and it's hot. And I felt like I am connected to generations and generations of people across time and place in this very ancient location. That just thought, I felt so, when I think of thin places, I think about how we're connected across time and place. And I felt that really deeply, kind of standing amidst the rubbles of people attempting to build pyramids. Another one was Victoria Falls, which is kind of goes along the boundary of Zambia and Zimbabwe. And there's this one spot called the Knife's Edge, which sounds scary, and it is scary. So you stand kind of overlooking the falls. And it was misty and there were rainbows everywhere because of the way the water falls. And it was spectacular. And I had this moment, I call it a 360 moment, which I have those in my everyday life too. But a 360 moment is when I'm standing or sitting in a place and I feel like I need to soak this in. I need to take a panoramic mental image of this moment. And so I physically do like a 360 turn around and just soak it in. And so I had a 360 moment standing on the Knife's Edge of Victoria Falls. And then another one was the Doubtful Sound in New Zealand on the South Island. It's on the edge of where the Tasman Sea meets New Zealand. And it's sometimes called the Sound of Silence. It's one of the most silent places in the world. It's so remote. And I watched both the sunset and the sunrise over the Doubtful Sound. I was on a boat and I got up really early in the morning so that no one else was awake. And I just sat on the boat and watched the sky and listened to nothing. And it was so beautiful. And I this is back to your question about traveling solo. Like I had this moment when I thought, I wish someone were experiencing this with me. This is one of the most spectacular moments in my life and I'm alone. And then I thought, I'm experiencing this with me. Like I am right here on the Doubtful Sound, listening to nothing, watching the sunrise, and I'm right here with me. And I thought to myself, I get to spend the rest of my life with myself. And that felt like this moment of like not ignoring the sort of pain of feeling like I wish I wasn't the only person in this moment, but also like grasping onto the beauty of that.
Yeah. I got a little teary-eyed hearing about your 360 moments.
Yeah, and I try to use that 360 moments in my everyday life. Like I love the title of your podcast, that these thin places can be like traveling to this grand location, but it can also be in the everyday mundane parts of life. So I try to have my 360 moments, even, once in a while it'll hit me as I'm like making myself eggs and hash browns for breakfast. And I can like take in the smell and be like, I am breathing and I'm alive and I'm drinking coffee and I'm making myself eggs and potatoes and I need to soak this in.
You should be a spokesperson for our podcast, because I think that's a lot of what we're really hoping to highlight in our conversations. And, I feel like probably travel has helped you to be more aware of those things and those moments. But even for people who can't travel or don't travel, there's thin places all around us all the time.
Yeah. And I think both in those delightful moments, like I adore potatoes. So it's delightful to me that I get to make myself potatoes for breakfast. And so that kind of delight we can feel very deeply and soak it in and be present to. And I also think, like, I've been thinking a lot about grief lately with like all sorts of layers of what's happening in the world. And I experienced a lot of grief while I was traveling too, both for myself, some of the grief I've mentioned about like, I wish I wasn't experiencing this alone sometimes, but also I feel the grief of places and of people pretty deeply. So I'm an empath. And so I can kind of absorb the grief of other people, even if I don't really know them. So if I'm sitting on the train and I see someone crying, I like feel that with them, even though I don't know what's going on for them. And so for me, there were a lot of like pain points with travel in terms of feeling like the grief of locations, of like, there's all sorts of histories of like pain embedded in places and in people's stories. And although that's not necessarily fun stuff to talk about, I think the more that we can be present to that grief, the more of a thin place it is, and the more we can let it like shape us and mold us in ways that make us more loving and softer. So I felt that a lot while I was traveling, and I'm trying to do that in my own life lately when I feel like the grief of the world so heavily. Like, I don't want to numb out to that. I don't want to pretend it's not there, but I want to be present to it and let it make me softer, let it make me more full of love and more full of grace and more full of hope. So I think that can be experienced, on the edge of Victoria Falls, or, on your couch as you're mourning whatever it is that you're mourning in your life or in the world.
Mm-hmm. So you and I had some travel canceled this year. We were supposed to meet up for a bit of an adventure, and then the world happened, and that had to be canceled. And I know that at some point we will put that back on the calendar. That was just a quick meetup in New York City. But I would love to hear what other future travels you're dreaming about and planning for.
Yeah, so I think for me, this is a layered question because, first of all, while I was planning this big trip, people would ask me like, oh, where are you going? And I would tell them, and some people are like, oh, that's cool. But most people are like, well, what about country X or Y? You're not going here? So I kept like the shadow list of all the places that I would like to go in future times. And I have a list. But also one other thing as I was reflecting about thin places and even really grief and the idea of like changing and being open, one thing that was a challenge for me as I was traveling is I started feeling a little bit uncomfortable with like the connection between travel and climate change, and like what my role as like a global person is, and how do we think about the impact of our choices. So that's something I'm wrestling with. So I don't really have I don't have a nice neat bow for that. I don't have a nice neat bow for anything, but I definitely don't have a nice neat bow for that. So that's something I'm kind of trying to be intentional about thinking through now that we're in a season where we can't really travel. Like, what does that look like for how I want to engage with the world once we're in a different place as a globe? So I've been asking myself questions like, how do we think about being present to places when we can't physically be there? How do we think about like partnering with people and with organizations who are like doing good work? And also, how can we like learn some of the things that we learn through travel in other creative ways? Because I think ultimately like traveling is being connected to a global community. And I think there's lots of ways to do that, even from our couches. I have a list of places I still want to go, and I do hope to go to some of them, but I'm also kind of asking myself some of those questions about like, how do I do this responsibly? How do I, in this season where none of us can really travel, like how do we still engage with our values connected to like traveling and being part of a global community?
Let us know when you figure out the answer.
Will do. Don't hold your breath.
Are there ways that since, especially having such a big trip behind you, something you plan for and then you experience it, but the bulk of your life is going to be with that in the rear view for you? Are there ways that you, through physical objects or pictures or videos, what are your favorite ways to sort of transport you back to the delight of those places, even when you're back home into regular life now?
Yeah, that's a great thought. And I was reading an article that was saying, like, how do you imprint your experiences into your life? Like, it doesn't have to be travel, it could be anything. Like, we have these experiences and then we sometimes like file them away. We don't like imprint them into us. And so I love the idea of like, how do I imprint those experiences? So for me, food is a big part of how I imprint experiences. So I took some cooking classes while I was traveling, and I plan to do a lot of, eventually when we can, like cooking for people and hosting meals connected to travel. So I actually started traveling virtually when I was finishing up my PhD in Philly. I had an existential crisis because I was like, I just finished a dissertation and now I don't know what to do with my life. And I decided to do a project of cooking meals from 50 different countries. And the idea was to try to like learn how to cook different cuisines, learn about different cultures, and also create community. So I decided I'm going to cook a meal from another culture and invite friends over to share in the meal with me. And I started kind of keeping track of it. And I called it couch cuisine because the idea was I can't afford to travel as a graduate student, but I can sit on my couch and read about, Syrian cuisine and cook it and invite people over. So I started doing that in 2010, and I've done that consistently-ish over the past decade, I guess, at this point. And it's been a really good way for me to build community since I've lived in different places during that time, and to just be like invitational to host people and also to learn. So I plan to continue that. I had big plans that when I got back, I would host a big bash and cook all these different meals from some of my favorite places that I visited, but that is on pause given COVID. But that's something for me that is a like very tangible, like physical and emotional way to like nourish my body and nourish other people's bodies and like connect over food and memories. So I look forward to doing that at some point in the future. One of my friends heard the name couch cuisine, and he was like, oh, that's because you make us sit on couches and on the floor because you don't have enough seating for all of us, right? And I was like, that's much better than my initial plan for what the name was. So yes, couch cuisine means I invite people over even though I don't have matching plates and I don't have seating for everyone. You grab a seat on the couch and balance the plate on your lap and relax and get to know people. So I think for me, that kind of connection between community and food and travel coalesces in those moments that I'm sad to not be able to do right now, but it gives me more time to menu plan.
You can just brush up on all those cooking skills so you'll really be ready once we're all able to safely gather together.
That's right. My recipes will be tried and tested.
I think that's really impressive that you have done that for 10 years. This is a project that you started a decade ago, and it's something that you're still passionate about. And it's something that so many people have benefited from. Just like you were mentioning that you've lived in different places, and there's probably like 40 or 50 people going about life saying, I have this friend Melody and she does this really cool thing. Probably more than 40 or 50 people. Like I don't know the numbers of how many people have gotten to experience couch cuisine, but I just think it's so neat. Like there may be another podcast out there somewhere where somebody's telling this story of this woman who does couch cuisine. I just think that's like really amazing.
Yeah, I hadn't realized it had been a decade until I said that out loud to you, realizing, oh gosh, 2010 was a decade ago. And my initial plan was to do 50 countries. And initially, my plan was to do one country a week and complete it in a year because I watched Julie and Julia and got over ambitious. And then like 3 weeks in, I was like, this is turning into a lifetime goal, not a year goal. But I've done 49 countries. So my next one will be 50, which is, I was like, oh, that's perfect. I'll do my 50th after I've had this big trip. And I will. It'll just be a little delayed. But it has been a really meaningful way for me to feel connected to people. You know, one of the sadnesses about being single and living alone and not having kids is like, I love feeding people. And my everyday life includes feeding myself, which is someone and is important, but I don't have the kind of gather around the table thing that I love as part of my daily life. And so for me, couch cuisine and other forms of hosting people is, you know, it's creating family, it's creating community over food, and sharing, like, you know, the messy, complicated stuff of life. And those things are those are my favorite moments in life, is like sitting around the table with people, sharing. And, you know, it's like the table is a thin place for me. Like, you know, there's something about being around a table and eating is a very vulnerable thing. It's very, like intimate. And I think people kind of tend to open up when they're sitting at a table together. And so, I've actually never thought about it this way until we're talking now, but I think the table is a very thin place for me. And so I love creating those moments for myself and other people. And so I hold on to the memories of those times that have happened and look forward to when they happen again, and honestly grieve the fact that they are on pause right now. All of those things at the same time.
I just love your awareness of the coexistence of all the complexities. It's so tempting for us as humans to like, this is this thing and that is another thing. And I think that it makes your life just such a beautiful reflection of our idea that it's amazing to be human. And it's not amazing to be human because of the Instagram moments, standing at the edge of Victoria Falls. But it's beautiful to be human because even when it's hard to be human, there's a richness to it. And all those contrasts are what makes, that's what makes life so meaningful. And that's what makes going through different seasons meaningful. And that's what makes all the different people that cross our paths help to make our life so much richer.
Yeah, I love that. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about, like, instead of thinking in either or terms, think in both and terms. So that's probably the thing that I tell myself the most, especially these days, is like, this is a both and time. Like, you can both be filled with delight and filled with grief. You can be both hopeful and devastated, and you can experience like the bliss of travel, and you can also feel sad. And I think that is a really helpful framing for us, whether we're, you know, in Zambia or in, you know, our backyard thinking about life. Is like, it's all of these things at once, and that is okay. Because I think the temptation is like, oh no, I feel sad right now, so all of this I'm missing out on. Or, oh, I feel hopeful right now, but things are such in shambles. How can I feel hopeful? And so I think the both and gives us permission to feel all the things at once, and to be okay with that, and to see that as like complex messiness, which messiness is good. That's what being human is. It's messy. And that's okay. And that is what connects us to each other, right? We connect to each other when we're honest about like the raw, yucky stuff. That's how we build community, right?
Well, I am grateful to have you in my community.
Me too.
And I feel like we could talk to you all day, and we probably should have you back, starting with the table as a thin place.
That's pretty good, huh? That just popped into my head, but I like that one. You can run with that.
I would love your permission to share some of your images from your travels on our Instagram. So for our listeners.
The Instagrammable moment.
That's right.
Just always remember there's mess behind them.
Yeah. Oh, and I've seen some of them and they are stunning and surreal. So thank you.
It is a beautiful world. I mean, especially during these really intense times, I think it's helpful for us to remind ourselves, like, this is a gloriously beautiful world filled with gloriously beautiful people. And it always has been, and it always will be. And at the same time, it's messy and hard.
Well, is there any sort of organization or cause that is near and dear to your heart that we could share with our listeners?
I love that question. And so there is an organization that for me has kind of captured a lot of what we've been talking about here in terms of thinking about the both and like the messiness, and also how do we be more like loving and open. So I have a t-shirt from them that I wore a lot on my trip as a reminder to myself, and that I wear when I'm having an especially hard day. And the t-shirt says "Love Anyway." So the organization is Preemptive Love Coalition, which is preemptivelove.org. And they're a coalition that does work across multiple countries, and they focus on like relief in areas of conflict, and they focus on job opportunities, and they're really committed to peacemaking. And one of the things I love that they talk about is like, they use the term unmake violence. How do we unmake violence in our own hearts and in the world? How do we like choose love over fear? And how do we be peacemakers? So not peacekeepers, but peacemakers. So they're an organization that I think is great to support, but they're also just really a place that I learn a lot from. So when things feel really messy in the world, I often look at what they have to say about it. And they are just a really wise group of people who are great at thinking through what does love look like in the complexity of really complicated situations in the world. So I think they're a great kind of learning tool for us.
Great. Well, we'll put a link to their website on the show notes on our website, on our website for this vlog. Maybe we'll tag them in some of your Instagram pictures as well.
Yeah.
So we can get a little of their attention and let them know that we value what they do. But we really value you, and we value your time, and are so thankful that you have shared, not just from your experience. You haven't just told us this is what happened and this is where I went, but for opening up your heart in tender ways. And since travel has cracked you open, as you said, thank you for putting that beautiful heart on display for our listeners to get to enjoy hearing from you and hearing your perspective. And I feel richer for having had this time with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you both. Tender is my word for the year. I choose a word a year. Instead of setting resolutions, I pick a word of the year. And so my word of the year is tender. So that was very affirming to me that you just said that and in that way. So I appreciate you both for creating this space. This is a really important conversation. I'll be cheering for you because I think this is exciting. So thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Now it's our turn to hear from you. So would you do us a big favor and go into your podcast app and rate us? Even better, would you write us a glowing review? That will help other listeners to find us. And make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode.
You can also visit our website at everydaythinplaces.com, where you will find all sorts of fun and interesting information, as well as learn about how you can help to support this podcast and earn special exclusive perks. There you will also find links to follow us on social media, or else just pop directly over to Instagram or Facebook, where you will find us at Everyday Thin Places. Thanks so much for joining us today. Until next time, I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Rachel. Bye.